The snow fell harder than Margaret had seen in years. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked out the cracked window of the boarding house. The landlord had given her until morning to pay rent or leave. With only 3 coins in her pocket and nowhere else to go, she knew tomorrow would bring nothing but cold streets and hungry nights. Margaret's husband had died 6 months ago in a mining accident. The company paid nothing to widows. Her small savings disappeared quickly, and now even the cheapest room in town was beyond her reach. At 28, she was still young, but the hard life had aged her face and hands. Her dark hair, once her pride, now hung limp and dull from poor eating and constant worry. The boarding house sat on the edge of Millfield, a rough frontier town where men outnumbered women 10 to 1. Most women here were either married, working in saloons, or passing through on their way to better places. Margaret had tried to find honest work, but shops wanted experienced girls, not desperate widows. The saloon offered her a job, but she refused. She would rather freeze than sell herself. As she watched the storm grow stronger, Margaret heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Henley, the landlord's wife, appeared at her door with a cold expression. "Time's up, dear. Pay up or pack up?" Margaret stood slowly. "Please, Mrs. Henley, just one more day. I'm expecting word about a job." "You've been expecting that word for 3 weeks. I run a business, not a charity." Mrs. Henley's voice carried no sympathy. "Out by sunrise, or I'll have my husband remove you." The door slammed shut, leaving Margaret alone with her fears. She owned almost nothing now. 1 dress, 1 pair of worn boots, and a small bag with her few remaining possessions. The thought of walking into that storm with nowhere to go made her stomach twist with terror. Meanwhile, 15 miles outside town, Jake Morrison stood in his kitchen and stared at the empty shelves. The storm had been building for days, and he knew it would last at least a week. His supplies were running dangerously low. Worse than that, he was completely alone on his ranch with no way to get help if something went wrong. Jake was 35, tall and strong from years of hard work. His weather-beaten face showed the marks of sun and wind, and his hands were rough from handling cattle and tools. He had built his ranch from nothing over 10 years, working every day from sunrise to sunset. The land was good, the cattle healthy, and the buildings solid, but he had no one to share it with. He had been married once. Back in Texas, his wife Sarah died in childbirth along with their baby. The grief nearly destroyed him. He sold everything and moved west, thinking hard work and isolation would heal his heart. Now he realized it had only made him harder and more alone. The ranch needed constant work. Cattle needed tending, buildings needed repair, and 1,000 other tasks demanded attention. A man alone could barely manage, especially in winter. If he got sick or injured, he could die before anyone found him. Several times over the years he had considered getting married again, but he never seemed to meet suitable women. The few single women in town were either too young, already spoken for, or unsuitable for ranch life. Jake walked to his window and watched the snow pile higher against the barn. This storm was worse than usual. If it kept up, he might be trapped for 2 weeks or more. The thought of spending that much time completely alone made him restless and anxious. He needed help, and he needed it soon. In town, word traveled fast about the widow woman who was about to be thrown out in the storm. Men talked about it in the saloon, partly with sympathy and partly with interest. Single women were rare, and most men knew that Margaret was decent and hardworking, but none offered real help. Times were hard for everyone. Tom Bradley, who owned the general store, mentioned it to his wife over dinner. "Shame about the Morrison woman," he said. "Good woman by all accounts. Just got dealt a bad hand." "Her name is Margaret Wilson," his wife corrected. "And yes, it is a shame. But what can we do? We barely make ends meet ourselves." "I heard Jake Morrison was in town yesterday asking about hiring help for his ranch. Seemed pretty desperate. Too bad he needs a ranch hand, not a housekeeper." Mrs. Bradley paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. Why couldn't he hire a housekeeper? That place must be falling apart with no woman around. Because he lives 15 miles from anywhere. What single woman would go live alone with a man she barely knows? Besides, he couldn't pay much for just housework. He needs someone who can do everything. But Mrs. Bradley kept thinking about it. She had seen Margaret around town, always polite and clean despite her troubles. She had also heard stories about Jake's ranch, how well he had built it up despite working alone. Maybe there was a solution that could help both of them. The next morning, Mrs. Bradley put on her heavy coat and walked through the snow to the boarding house. She found Margaret sitting on her small bag outside the front door, shivering in the cold wind. "Margaret, dear, come inside where it's warm." Margaret looked up with tired eyes. "I can't, Mrs. Bradley. Mrs. Henley said I had to leave." "Nonsense. Come to my house. We need to talk." Margaret hesitated, then followed Mrs. Bradley through the snowy streets. The general store was closed for the morning, and they sat in the warm kitchen with hot coffee. "I have a proposition for you," Mrs. Bradley began carefully. "It's not conventional, but these aren't conventional times." Margaret waited, hoping for anything that might save her from the streets. "There's a rancher named Jake Morrison. Good man, works hard, built a fine place about 15 miles out. He's been asking around town about hiring help. He needs someone reliable." "What kind of help?" Margaret asked. "Everything. Cooking, cleaning, mending, maybe help with the animals. It's hard work, but he pays fair wages and provides room and board." Margaret felt a spark of hope. "That sounds perfect. When can I meet him?" Mrs. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "There's something else. He's not just looking for hired help. He's looking for a wife." The hope died in Margaret's eyes. "I see. Now wait, hear me out. It wouldn't have to be a real marriage right away. Just an arrangement that benefits both of you. You get food, shelter, and safety. He gets the help he desperately needs. If you both decide later that you suit each other, well, that's between you two." Margaret stared into her coffee cup. The idea of marrying a stranger terrified her, but sleeping in the snow terrified her more. What kind of man is he? "Honest and hard-working. Lost his first wife years ago. He's not cruel, doesn't drink too much, and he's built a good life for himself. Tom says he's always been fair in his business dealings." "Does he know about me? About my situation?" "Not yet. But I could send word if you're interested." Margaret thought about her options. She had none. The storm was getting worse, and she would not survive long outside in this weather. Even if this arrangement only lasted through the winter, it would give her time to figure out what to do next. How would this work? "I can't just show up at his ranch. I'll send my boy with a message. If Jake is interested, he can come to town and you two can meet. If you both agree, he can take you back with him before the storm gets worse." Margaret nodded slowly. "All right. Send the message." Mrs. Bradley wrote carefully. "Mr. Morrison, I know a woman who needs work and shelter. She's a good Christian woman, recently widowed, hardworking and honest. She can cook, clean, mend, and help around a ranch. She's also in need of protection and stability. If you're interested in meeting her to discuss an arrangement that might benefit both of you, please come to town today." "The storm is getting worse, Mrs. Bradley." Young Tommy Bradley fought through the snow on horseback to deliver the message. Jake read it twice, standing in his barn while the wind howled around the building. An arrangement. He knew what that meant. Mrs. Bradley was suggesting marriage, probably to help some desperate woman. The idea should have offended him, but instead he found himself considering it seriously. He was tired of being alone. Tired of cold dinners and unmended clothes. Tired of no one to talk to except his cattle. Most of all, he was tired of worrying about what would happen if he got hurt or sick with no one around to help. Marriage, for practical reasons, wasn't uncommon on the frontier. Love could grow between two people who respected each other and worked toward common goals. His parents had married that way back in Missouri, and they had been happy together for 40 years. Jake made his decision quickly. He saddled his best horse, loaded his wagon with supplies, and headed for town. If this woman was decent and willing to work, they could make an arrangement that helped them both. If not, he would buy supplies and head home alone. The ride to town took 3 hours through the worsening storm. Jake's beard froze with ice and his hands were numb despite thick gloves. By the time he reached the general store, he was nearly frozen. Mrs. Bradley met him at the door. "Jake, thank goodness you made it. Come in, warm up. Where is she?" Jake asked, stamping snow off his boots. "Upstairs." "I wanted to talk to you first." Mrs. Bradley poured him hot coffee. "Her name is Margaret Wilson. Her husband died in the mine accident 6 months ago. She's been trying to make it on her own, but you know how hard that is for a woman alone." Jake nodded. "What's she like?" "Good woman. Quiet, clean, hardworking. She's not looking for romance, just survival." "Are you serious about this arrangement?" "Depends on her. If she can work and won't cause trouble." The storm finally broke on the 6th day, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of snow. Jake spent the morning digging paths to the barn and chicken coop while Margaret organized the house and planned meals for their limited supplies. They worked together with an efficiency that surprised them both. When the month trial period ended, neither mentioned it. They had settled into a comfortable routine that benefited both of them. Margaret had gained weight and looked healthier than she had in months. Jake was eating regular meals, sleeping better, and felt less anxious about managing the ranch alone. The question of marriage hung unspoken between them. They had agreed to discuss it after a month, but both seemed reluctant to bring it up. Finally, one evening in late December, Margaret raised the topic while they sat by the fire. "Mr. Morrison, it's been over a month now." Jake looked up from the harness he was mending. "It has. Are you satisfied with the arrangement?" "Yes, very much." "Are you?" "More than satisfied. You've made this place feel like a real home again." They sat quietly for a moment, both thinking about what came next. "About the other matter," Margaret said carefully. "The marriage question." Jake set down his work. "What are your thoughts?" "Practically speaking, it would give me legal protection and security. And it would give you someone committed to staying and helping build this place up." "Those are good practical reasons," Jake agreed. "But I want you to know I wouldn't expect anything from you that you weren't comfortable with." Margaret nodded, her cheeks slightly pink. "I appreciate that. I think we could make a good partnership, given time." "Then we're agreed? A practical marriage for mutual benefit?" "Yes, when?" "As soon as we can get to town?" "Might not be until spring unless we get a break in the weather." They shook hands formally, sealing their agreement. It felt strange, but right. They were two practical people making a sensible decision about their futures. A week later, the weather cleared enough for travel. Jake hitched his strongest horses to the sleigh, and they made the difficult journey to town. The preacher married them in a simple ceremony with the Bradleys as witnesses. Margaret signed her name as Margaret Morrison and felt the strange weight of new identity. She was a wife again, but this time the circumstances were completely different. There was safety in this marriage, but also uncertainty about what it might become. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, legally bound, but still essentially strangers working toward common goals. Jake moved Margaret's few belongings to the larger bedroom they would now share, but he set up a bed for himself in the spare room. "Until we both decide otherwise," he explained. And Margaret was grateful for his consideration. Winter deepened, and they were often snowbound for days at a time. During these long, quiet periods, they talked more openly about their pasts, their fears, and their hopes. Margaret told Jake about her first marriage, how her husband had been kind but impractical, always chasing dreams instead of building security. "I loved him," she said one evening, "but I worried constantly about money and the future. He thought love would solve everything." Jake talked about his first wife and their lost baby. "Sarah was everything to me. When she died, I thought I would never care about anyone again. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that didn't hurt. Do you still miss her terribly?" Jake was quiet for a long time. "I'll always miss her. But the sharp pain has faded to a gentle sadness. I think she would want me to be happy again." As winter progressed, they grew more comfortable with each other. Margaret began to smile and laugh more often. Jake found himself looking forward to coming inside each evening to the warm house and good company. Neither mentioned moving their sleeping arrangement. But the tension around the subject was gradually fading. Margaret proved to be everything Jake had hoped for in a ranch partner. She learned quickly about cattle and horses, helped with difficult births, and showed no fear of hard work. During a blizzard in January, when one of the barns partially collapsed, she worked alongside him for hours in freezing wind to move the animals to safety. "You could have stayed in the house where it was warm," Jake told her afterwards as they sat exhausted by the fire. "Those cattle are our livelihood now," Margaret replied simply. "We succeed or fail together." Jake felt something shift in his chest at her use of our and we. This was more than just a business arrangement. They were building something together. Margaret found that Jake was nothing like her first husband. Where Tom had been dreamy and impractical, Jake was steady and reliable. Where Tom had made grand promises he couldn't keep, Jake simply did what needed doing without fanfare. She began to feel something she hadn't expected, respect that was slowly growing into affection. One night in February, a pack of wolves threatened the cattle. Jake grabbed his rifle and headed outside. But Margaret stopped him. "You're not going out there alone," she said. Loading the second rifle, they spent the night taking turns on guard duty, protecting their herd from the hungry wolves. Working together through the danger brought them closer than months of ordinary routine had done. When spring finally arrived, the snow melted to reveal the ranch in good condition despite the harsh winter. Jake's careful preparations and Margaret's efficient management had seen them through successfully. They had enough cattle to breed, enough supplies to last until the growing season, and enough money to make improvements. "We did well," Jake said one morning, looking out over the green pastures. "We did," Margaret agreed. And she realized she was thinking of the ranch as truly theirs now, not just his place where she worked. As the weather warmed, Margaret planted an extensive garden. She had plans for preserving vegetables, raising chickens for eggs and meat, and maybe even keeping a milk cow. Jake watched her planning and working with growing admiration. She wasn't just maintaining his ranch, she was improving it. In May, Jake decided it was time to expand the herd. He would need to travel to Denver to buy cattle, a trip that would take nearly a week. The old Jake would have worried about leaving the ranch unattended. Now he knew Margaret could handle anything that came up. "I trust you completely," he told her the night before leaving. "You know this place as well as I do now?" Margaret felt a warm glow at his confidence in her. "I'll take good care of everything." The night before Jake's departure, they lingered longer than usual by the fire. Both felt the approaching separation keenly, though neither spoke of it directly. "Margaret," Jake said finally, "I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done. You've given me back my life." "You saved my life," she replied softly. "I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't taken me in." They looked at each other across the firelight, both aware that their relationship had deepened far beyond their original practical arrangement. Jake left early the next morning with a wagon and traveling supplies. Margaret watched from the porch until he disappeared over the hill, then threw herself into spring cleaning and garden work to keep from missing him too much. 3 days into Jake's absence, trouble came. Margaret was working in the garden when she heard riders approaching fast. She straightened up to see 4 rough-looking men on horseback. The kind who made honest folks nervous. The leader, a big man with a scraggly beard and cold eyes, dismounted and walked toward her with an unpleasant smile. Well, look what we found. A pretty little woman all alone." Margaret's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Good morning. Can I help you with something?" "Matter of fact, you can. We're looking for supplies. Figured a nice ranch like this could spare some food and maybe a horse or 2. My husband isn't here right now." "But he'll be back soon," Margaret lied, hoping they would leave rather than wait. The man laughed. "That's too bad for him and lucky for us. Makes things simpler." The other 3 men had dismounted and were looking around the ranch yard with obvious interest. Margaret realized they weren't just passing through. They planned to rob the place. "Take what supplies you need and go," Margaret said, trying to sound calm. "There's no need for trouble." "Oh, but there might be," the leader said, stepping closer. "Depends on how cooperative you are. We've been riding hard for days and we're tired of our own company." Margaret's blood went cold. She backed toward the house, her mind racing. Jake's rifle was inside, but she would have to get past these men to reach it. "Now don't be unfriendly," another man called out. "We just want some hospitality. And maybe some company for the night," added a third with a nasty laugh. Margaret reached the porch steps and paused. If she ran for the house, they would catch her before she could get the rifle. If she stayed outside, she was completely vulnerable. Either way, she was in terrible danger. "Please," she said, hating the tremor in her voice. "Just take what you want and leave." "We intend to," the leader said, reaching for her arm. At that moment, a rifle shot rang out from behind the barn. All four men spun around in surprise, and Margaret saw her chance. She ran for the house as fast as she could. Jake stepped out from behind the barn with his rifle raised. He had returned early and approached through the back pasture when he saw the strange horses in his yard. "Get your hands away from my wife," he said in a voice Margaret had never heard before. Cold and deadly, the four men looked, uncertain now that they faced an armed man instead of a helpless woman. "Easy." Summer brought prosperity to the Morrison Ranch like never before. Margaret's garden produced abundantly, providing fresh vegetables for their table and plenty to preserve for winter. The cattle Jake had bought were thriving, and several cows had produced strong calves that would grow into valuable breeding stock. Margaret threw herself into ranch work with renewed energy, now that she truly felt like a partner rather than an employee. She learned to milk cows, churn butter, and manage the chickens with expert skill. Her preserving skills ensured they would have variety in their diet through the coming winter. Jake watched his wife with growing admiration and love. She had transformed from the desperate, frightened woman he had married into a confident, capable ranchwoman who could handle any challenge. More importantly, she had brought joy back into his life after years of loneliness and grief. Their marriage deepened throughout the summer months. They worked together during the day and talked together by firelight in the evenings. Jake told Margaret stories about his childhood in Texas and his dreams for expanding their ranch. Margaret shared her hopes of making their house a real home and maybe having children to fill the empty bedrooms. "Do you think about having a family?" Margaret asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Jake was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I was too old or too set in my ways. But with you, everything feels possible again." "I'd like that very much," Margaret said, taking his hand. "Children running around this ranch, learning to ride and work with cattle. They'd be lucky to have you for a mother." Margaret leaned against Jake's shoulder, feeling completely content for the first time since her first husband's death. This marriage was different from her first one, built on equal partnership rather than romantic dreams, but filled with deep affection and mutual respect. In August, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Jake the news one morning over breakfast, and he swept her up in his arms with joy. "Are you happy about it?" she asked, suddenly worried about his reaction. "Happy?" "Margaret, I'm overjoyed. I thought I'd never have the chance to be a father. I want to be a good mother. I want our children to feel safe and loved. They will be. Look what you've done with this place, with me. You turn everything you touch into something better." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall. Margaret continued working around the ranch, though Jake insisted she avoid the heaviest tasks. He hired a young man named Billy to help with the hardest work, giving Margaret time to prepare for the baby. As winter approached, they were better prepared than ever before. The root cellar was full of preserved vegetables. The barn was stocked with hay for the cattle, and the house was warm and comfortable. This time, the isolation didn't worry them. They had each other and a baby on the way. The baby arrived during a February blizzard, with Margaret attended by Mrs. Bradley, who had come to stay for the birth. Jake paced the kitchen, worried sick, until he heard a baby's cry from upstairs. Mrs. Bradley appeared with a smile. "You have a son, Jake, and Margaret is doing fine." Jake climbed the stairs on shaking legs to find Margaret holding a tiny, red-faced baby with dark hair like his mother's. "He's perfect," Jake whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "James Thomas Morrison," Margaret said. After both our fathers? Jake kissed Margaret's forehead and then his son's. Thank you for giving me a family again. The baby thrived despite the harsh winter. Margaret proved to be a natural mother, and Jake was a devoted father who spent every free moment with his son. Young Billy proved invaluable. Handling many ranch chores while Jake helped with the baby, spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Word had spread about the success of the Morrison Ranch, and other settlers were moving into the area. Jake was offered a contract to supply beef to a mining camp 50 miles north, which would bring substantial income. It means more work, Jake told Margaret as they discussed the opportunity. We'd need to expand the herd significantly. Then we expand, Margaret said confidently. We've proven we can handle whatever comes. It would mean hiring more help, building more facilities. Are you sure you want to take on that much? Margaret looked around their comfortable kitchen, then at baby James sleeping peacefully in his cradle. Jake, 2 years ago I was facing starvation and homelessness. Now look at us. I believe we can do anything we set our minds to. They decided to accept the contract and began planning for expansion. Jake would need to buy more cattle and hire additional ranch hands. Margaret would manage the household and help coordinate the increased activity. The success brought new challenges. Managing hired hands required different skills than working alone. Some of the men were respectful and hardworking, but others tested Jake's authority and made inappropriate comments about Margaret. One afternoon, a new hand named Charlie crossed the line. Margaret was hanging laundry when he approached her with a leering smile. Pretty little thing like you must get lonely with your husband working so much. I'm perfectly content. Thank you, Margaret replied coolly, continuing her work. Bet a woman like you has needs her husband can't meet? Man like me could show you some excitement. Margaret dropped the laundry and faced him directly. You're out of line, Charlie. Go back to work. Or what? You'll tell your husband? Maybe I'll just take what I want right now. He reached for her, but Margaret was ready. She had learned to defend herself during her months of poverty and fear. She grabbed the heavy laundry paddle and swung it hard, catching Charlie across the face. Touch me again and I'll shoot you, she said calmly. Charlie staggered back, holding his bleeding nose. You crazy woman. I'll tell Morrison you attacked me for no reason. Go ahead. Tell him exactly what happened. Jake appeared from the barn, drawn by the commotion. He took in the scene, Margaret standing straight and unafraid, Charlie bleeding and furious, the other hands watching from a distance. What happened here? Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. Your wife attacked me for being friendly, Charlie whined. Jake looked at Margaret. Is that what happened? Charlie made improper advances and threatened to force himself on me. I defended myself. Jake nodded, then walked over to Charlie. Without warning, he grabbed the man by his shirt and lifted him off the ground. Pack your gear and get off my land. If I see you again, I'll kill you. He threw Charlie toward the bunkhouse, then turned to the other hands who had been watching. Anyone else have questions about how to treat my wife? The men shook their heads and quickly returned to work. That evening, Jake and Margaret talked about the incident. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, Jake said. Maybe we should reconsider this expansion. Absolutely not, Margaret replied firmly. We can't let men like Charlie control our decisions. We just need to be more careful about who we hire. You handled yourself well today. I was proud of you. I learned to take care of myself during those months on my own. I'm not the helpless woman you married. Jake smiled. You never were helpless. You were just in an impossible situation. As their first wedding anniversary approached, Jake and Margaret reflected on how much their lives had changed. They had built a successful ranch, welcomed a healthy baby, and found love neither had expected. Do you ever regret marrying me? Margaret asked one evening as they sat by the fire with baby James. Never. Do you regret saying yes to my proposal? It wasn't much of a proposal, Margaret laughed. More like a business negotiation. Would you like a proper proposal now? What do you mean? Jake stood up and got down on one knee beside Margaret's chair, taking her hand. Margaret Morrison, I love you more than I thought possible. Will you marry me again? This time for love instead of necessity? Margaret felt tears in her eyes. Yes, Jake Morrison. I'll marry you as many times as you want. They decided to have a renewal ceremony in town, celebrating their love with the friends who had helped bring them together. Mrs. Bradley cried with happiness as she watched them exchange new vows, this time promising love, honor, and devotion rather than just practical partnership. The second year of their marriage brought continued prosperity. The beef contract was renewed, and Jake was able to buy adjacent land to expand their grazing area. Margaret proved to be an excellent manager, keeping track of finances and coordinating the increased household activity. In the fall, Margaret announced she was pregnant again. This time, Jake was calmer but no less delighted. "I hope it's a girl," he said, rubbing Margaret's still flat belly. She could look just like her beautiful mother. "As long as the baby is healthy, I don't care," Margaret replied, "though it would be nice to have one of each." The second baby arrived the following spring, a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, after Jake's first wife and Margaret's mother. Jake held his daughter with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the blessing of a second chance at family happiness. As they settled into life with two children, Jake and Margaret often marveled at the journey that had brought them together. What had begun as a desperate arrangement between two lonely people had grown into something beautiful and lasting. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Mrs. Bradley hadn't thought to introduce us, Margaret said one evening as they watched their children play. "Someone else would have thought of it eventually," Jake replied. "We were meant to find each other." "Do you really believe that?"